Today we have the great privilege of hosting Professor William Rees, a renowned ecologist and ecological economist. So let me briefly introduce Professor Rees. He's Professor Emeritus and former Director of the University of British Columbia School of Community and Regional Planning. His research focuses on global ecological trends, particularly the vulnerability of cities as part of the human ecosystem and the psychological and cognitive barriers to societal change. He's widely recognized as the originator and co-developer of ecological footprint analysis. Professor Rees has also authored hundreds of peer-reviewed and popular articles on these topics and is a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. He's also a founding member and former president of the Canadian Society for Ecological Economics, a founding director of the One Earth Living Initiative, and a fellow of the Post-Carbon Institute. His contributions to ecological economics and sustainability have earned him numerous prestigious awards, including the Trudeau Foundation Fellowship, the Balding Prize in Ecological Economics, and the Blue Planet Prize. This is just to mention a few. And as I already know, William, he's also a great guy, so I'm also really happy that he has joined us today. And he brings a wealth of knowledge and experience to today's discussion. His lecture today will focus on a topic of critical importance, which is modern humans, unsustainable by nature and nurture. So without further ado, I am pleased to hand the floor to our distinguished guest, Professor William Rees. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are honored to have you. And yeah, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Paula, and it's a privilege to be here. Welcome everyone for taking a part of your evening to spend with me. As Paula said, I'm trying to make the case that the current state of the world, which is clearly an unsustainable state, is entirely natural. And it's both natural because of our biology and because of the way we have developed our society, modern techno-industrial society. This is a very complicated issue. And so this talk is going to be quite complicated, quite involved. I'm going to bring in elements of biology, economics, of philosophy, other domains of science. And we're going to try to tie all of these things together to give us a more comprehensive understanding of the human ecological predicament than we might normally acquire. The starting point for this talk is really something a philosopher friend of mine, Alan Drengson, said many years ago. He argued that no amount of logical reasoning, legal argumentation, or ethical axiology, that's just discussion, will solve a problem that is misunderstood. And so what I'm basically trying to get across to you today is that modern techno-industrial society, the world we live in, misunderstands the global ecological crisis. At least we pretend we do. At present, we're defining this as a technical problem or as an economic problem. It's not either economic or rather technical. It's an inevitable biosocial phenomenon, and yet hardly anyone discusses the biosocial dimensions. So let's start with looking at the problem through two different kinds of lenses. I'm a biologist, I'm an ecologist. So the first lens I want to discuss is what I will call the reality lens. And this starts with the premise that human beings, our species, is actually part of nature. The core concept here is a statement made by Teodosius Dobzhansky, a Russian-American geneticist many decades ago. And he said, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And what I've argued is that human beings, like all other known species, is a product of nature. We are a product of evolution. So it follows that nothing in human affairs makes sense except in light of evolution. So what we're going to try to do today in part is to interpret the current ecological crisis in an evolutionary light. The second element of this is culture, and nurture, if you like, what we learn as human beings as part of a society. And here the core concept is entirely different. And it's a concept that is built into most of our disciplines. And it is that humans are not part of nature. Because of our superior intelligence, our moral superiority, and some people believe we have a soul, humans are simply not part of nature. And if we're not part of nature, we are exempt from biophysical laws. We don't have to pay attention to the laws of thermodynamics, for example. So what this means is that our evolutionary history, everything I talked about on the previous slide, and our genetic endowment have no bearing whatsoever on how the future unfolds. We believe, our culture believes, that human motivations and behaviors are wholly determined by social and cultural factors. So I want to emphasize we have two completely opposing views of nature here. On the one hand, I argue humans are part of nature, and on the other hand, as this graphic shows, we're outside of nature. Okay, I want to look at those two ways of perceiving our predicament in the context of climate change. So we're going to now consider a little bit how the world deals with global heating. And I want to emphasize that this is a horrific problem. It's a real challenge. I'm not for a moment saying that we're not in trouble here. The main issues are clear from the data. Carbon dioxide levels are the highest they've been in 14 million years. 2024 was the warmest year in the instrumental record. 2023, pardon me, was the warmest year before that. And the global community, the world is now on track for 3 Celsius degrees of mean global warming, which implies climate chaos, the crossing of tipping points. It risks food supplies and all kinds of havoc later in this century. So there's no question about that. And here's the recent graphics from a European program, for example, that shows 2023 and the beginning there up till the end of February of this year, of last year rather, right off the charts. Unprecedented in history in terms of global warming. Climate scientists have actually lost track of what's going on here. Gavin Schmidt is the director of the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies in the United States, one of the top climate scientists. And these are quotes of his from last year. For the past 9 months, and that's up until March of 2024, mean land and sea surface temperatures overshot previous records each month by 0.2 Celsius degrees, a huge margin on the planetary scale. Climate scientists don't really know what's going on. We are unable to reconcile our theories with what has happened. So in other words, even the scientists have lost confidence in their own models in many respects about what's happening. And by the way, the extreme anomalies of temperature and weather events continued for 6 months after this statement was made. So let me underscore again that climate change is enormously serious. We're on track for catastrophe, and we're not even quite clear what the science is telling us about what's going on. However, and despite all of that, the present simplistic reductionist focus on climate change is delusionally misdirected. So again, understand me, climate change is a huge problem. We're spending an enormous amount of attention and money on it, and this is incorrect. Politically, and we're doing it because the politically and economically acceptable solutions to climate change are all technology-based and have great economic implications. In fact, if you go online, you can find that climate change represents a huge economic opportunity for investment, profit making, and so on and so forth. And the problem is that these technical solutions oriented toward growing the economy are not fixing the climate, and they are actually worsening the bigger problem of what is called ecological overshoot or eco-overshoot. So again, climate change is a distraction from acknowledging and responding to our real ecological predicament. And here's the evidence that it's not working. This graph shows the increasing carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere over the last, 60 odd years. But if we just go back to 1990 or 1992, 1992 was the year in which the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was drafted and adopted. Since then, we've had 29 COP meetings designed to reduce carbon emissions. The last one was in Azerbaijan in just November and December of last year. You can see that since 1992, when this whole focus on climate was instituted, it's had almost no effect whatsoever on the increasing uptick of carbon dioxide emissions in the atmosphere. So that by the time of that conference in Azerbaijan, carbon dioxide levels had reached 420 parts per million, which is 51% above pre-industrial levels, which were about 280 parts per million. So again, my point is that we've been focusing on the climate problem. All of these conferences and many other things dedicated toward reducing emissions. We've had 53 years of this, 29 COP conferences, a half a dozen major international climate agreements, various scientists warning, and so on and so forth, and it has failed utterly to reduce atmospheric concentrations. Now, in fairness, there may be fewer emissions than there would have been otherwise, but it has not succeeded in reducing concentrations. In fact, they've increased by 60-some% since the beginning. So we have a tunnel vision here. There are a huge array of problems, and yet the focus on climate ignores that big picture. So our modern techno-industrial society has a tendency to fixate on a single problem at a time, such as climate change or emissions. Then we go to biodiversity loss, and then we talk about the pandemic, and then we may be concerned for a few weeks about territorial conflicts such as you're having in Europe right now, but then we get back to climate change. Most people are incapable of connecting the dots, of making connections between these various problems to show that they're really part of the same phenomenon. And the phenomenon I'm talking about here is the real existential threat to humanity, at least from the ecological perspective, and that's overshoot. Overshoot is the cause of all those other problems. Overshoot can be defined quite simply. It just means that the human enterprise, the total mass of humans and our economies, are consuming even self-producing resources, renewable resources, such as fish stocks and forests and so on, and replenishable resources, such as fresh water, aquifers, and soils. We're consuming all of these things much faster than they can regenerate in nature. And we're producing what is often toxic wastes greatly in excess of the nature's assimilated capacity. So again, the human enterprise is consuming even replenishable and renewable resources faster than they can renew themselves, and we're dumping wastes faster than nature can take them up. So that is the cause of all of our problems. So we're literally depleting and degrading the biophysical basis of our own existence. There are too many people consuming and polluting too much. All so-called environmental problems, plunging biodiversity, ocean acidification, tropical deforestation, desertification, more frequent pandemics, soil and landscape degradation, falling sperm counts, the pollution of everything, even land and resource wars, I guess we're very familiar with that these days, are examples of too many people on too little land, consuming and polluting too much. All of these are co-symptoms of overshoot. Climate change is a co-symptom of overshoot. It's an excess waste problem. Carbon dioxide emissions are enormous, and they're the largest waste product by weight from industrial economies. And we're simply overwhelming the natural capacity of the ecosphere to assimilate the carbon dioxide. But the driving cause is overshoot. Carbon dioxide emissions and climate change are merely symptoms of the overshoot problem. Overshoot is a disease, and overshoot is a terminal condition. We cannot continue to deplete and degrade the biophysical basis of our own existence. So how do we explain that we got into this mess where we're literally destroying our own fundamental foundations, and yet we're supposed to be intelligent species? And I would argue there are, again, two factors, and we're going back to the beginning. The first is the biological or evolutionary factor. We aren't consciously aware of this, but human beings have three qualities that we share with all other species. We will expand into all accessible habitat. And if you think about it, no other animal species on the planet has a range of habitats as large as human beings. We live in every conceivable situation, even the Antarctic, which isn't really accessible. Human beings will tend to consume all available accessible resources to the limit of our technology. So if you think of fisheries, for example, we just keep consuming more and more of the world's fish, and every time fishing technology improves, more fish stocks collapse. We will use up all oil and natural gas resources, for example, to the limits of our capacity to exploit them. And the third characteristic is that in the case of humans, accessible and available are constantly being redefined, upgraded by technological advances. So all species will do these things, expand into all habitat, consume all accessible resources, but we're better at it than some of these other species. So we have evolved the capacity through technology to exploit nature much more effectively than other species do. But it's a a trait that humans share with all other species. These are monkeys that discovered how to break open clamshells using rocks. So like humans, they're tool using. And as soon as they learned to do this, they used up all the resources. The heading here from this article is that tool wielding monkeys push shellfish to extinction. Well, that's what humans do when we learn new technologies that enable us to exploit nature more and more. So humans have more advanced technology, but this simply makes us competitively superior to ecologically similar species, both in acquiring habitat and all other resources, including food. We're going to return to this in a little while. Now, I want us to think about the human brain in this context. We think of ourselves as very intelligent, and that's natural, I suppose. But let's look at the evolutionary history of the brain. The brain evolved when human beings lived in very small tribal groups in limited, predictable environments that posed only modest challenges to the evolving nervous system. So we modern peoples have the same brains as Paleolithic peoples, actually slightly smaller, less complex. And we have a corresponding repertoire of emotions and behavioral predisposition, tendencies to behave in certain ways because of our evolutionary heritage. This is why even we modern people tend to fixate on a single problem at a time. The economy, emissions, the pandemic, or whatever. Modern people, like our simple ancestors, don't get complexity. We generally don't connect the dots among various environmental problems. Okay? So the point I'm getting at here is that we are confined to intellectual capacities that were adequate for survival under very simple circumstances. This is what the brain looks like. It evolved in stages. At one point, we used to think of the brain as having jumped forward in three big leaps. All organisms with a brain at all, at least vertebrates, have a reptilian complex, the old brain at the bottom, which is responsible for physical survival and reproduction, and basic things that happen completely beneath consciousness. We're not even aware of these things happening. The midbrain or limbic system is where our emotions and feelings and responses to food and sex and so on reside. This mostly developed somewhat later. And human beings, of course, are known for their complex cerebrum, the cerebral hemispheres. That's the largest part of the human brain, perhaps 2/3 by weight. And this is the site of logic and reason, forward thinking, planning, technical manipulation, language and speech. So it's clearly vastly better advanced in humans than other species, but we still have these other regions of the brain. And the fact of the matter is that they are often capable, the reptilian brain stem and the limbic system are often completely capable of overriding the things that happen in our cerebral hemispheres. So that reason is frequently trumped by instinct and passion. We don't know this often because we live in the self-conscious, rational part of our brain, in our cerebral hemispheres. But when anything from simple comfort to safety or survival is threatened, innate behavioral responses, genetic propensities that operate beneath consciousness in the midbrain and reptilian brain stems can override our rational responses. So again, humans are not primarily a rational species. There's more to this, and the studies are coming out repeatedly. Something like 95% of our conscious thinking, or rather our unconscious thinking, I shouldn't put it that way, 95% of brain activity is below conscious awareness. Even important decisions are often made before we are aware that we have made them. So brain scientists or neuroscientists can now show us through electronic probing of the brain that we make decisions before we're even aware that they have been made. Another important factor is that natural selection selected for the right here and right now. For survival, right now and right here is much more important than 10 years or even 10 days from now. So evolution has shaped the brain to focus mainly on the next few minutes, that 10-minute period I mentioned. Those who can survive the next 10 minutes are much more likely to pass their genes on to the next generation. There's a little website here that talks a bit about that. Even economists recognize this tendency in human beings. We talk about the economic discount or the temporal discount, sometimes spatial and even social discounting. And what this means is that we naturally, it's an instinctive quality of our species to favor the familiar places and right now, as well as close relatives and friends. We favor these things over uncertain future places and unknown people in foreign lands. So again, temporal discounting is that we favor the here and now rather than the future, close relatives and friends rather than unknown people in foreign lands, which is one of the reasons why wealthy countries are so cavalier in not really paying close attention to climate change, because basically we think it's going to impact poorer people somewhere else. Most decision makers, and I think you'll find this is one of the commonest problems in geopolitics, we will find that most decisions and most decision makers risk imposing damage on the unborn and on total strangers in distant countries. We prefer to do that than to impose certain economic hardships on our own family, friends, and constituents today. And again, think of climate change. If we really wanted to avoid climate change, we could do so. But it would mean changing our lifestyles in ways that would be perceived by most people as hardships. And we won't do that because we prefer to impose the costs of climate change on other people in distant lands. So this is part of our natural tendencies derived from our primitive brains, and they stick with us today. Human thought processing is an extremely slow process. We just had a new study by Zhang and Meister in 2025 called the unbearable slowness of being. And they argue that the information processing throughput of the human brain, that's where we think things through, is only about 10 bits per second. And this helps to explain why we think in simplistic terms and why we can, in their words, we can only think of one thing at a time. And they argue that we can get away with just 10 bits per second, quote, because cognition at this very slow rate, information processing at this slow rate was sufficient for survival in the very primitive circumstances in which we evolved. Okay, I hope you've all understood then that human beings today, modern techno-industrial humans, for all our manipulative intelligence, are still confined in very major respects to behaviors and predispositions that result from our very primitive brains. Now, I'm going to make the case now that our brains are obsolete. So something becomes obsolete when a newer version comes along that is more efficient, effective, or otherwise functionally superior to the original. Well, we're not going to get a new brain that is more efficient, effective, or functionally superior. It also can become obsolete if the entity's environment changes so much that we are no longer able to function effectively and may become self-destructive. So again, the brain was perfectly adequate for pre-industrial or pre-agricultural circumstances, but circumstances have changed so rapidly, and the brain has not, that we are no longer capable of functioning effectively in our current circumstances and have become self-destructive. So by that second definition, the human brain is obsolete. Modern techno-industrial humans have not evolved beyond the cognitive limits, the limits of understanding set by our Paleolithic brains. The consequence is that people today are inherently maladapted to today's environment. So if we put it in very simple terms, in English, we have a term called meme. A meme is a nugget of cultural information, a technology such as a desktop or a laptop computer. A gene, obviously, is a nugget of biological information. And the biological information can be passed only between sequential generations. Significant change with a long-lived species such as humans takes many, many generations and thousands of years. So our brains are very slowly evolving. And in fact, some would argue they've actually regressed as a result of our technologies over time. Memes, on the other hand, are nuggets of cultural information that can be shared instantly among members of the same generation. Significant change can happen in days or months. So that's a huge contrast between our genetic capacity to move. So the memes, the evolution of memes, such as technology, computers, and so on, is much faster than genetic evolution. And I'm arguing that cultural evolution has vastly outpaced biological evolution. We are in a circumstance where we have created a culture that is changing much more rapidly than our biological equipment can keep up. So unlike our Paleolithic ancestors, who lived in very simple habitats, human beings today live in mind-numbingly complex, rapidly changing world systems of overlapping subsystems that we ourselves have created and that are constantly challenging our limited cognitive capacities. We are simply not cognitively equipped to fully understand, let alone control, all the workings of any major cultural subsystem. Nobody really comes to grips with an understanding of the global economy or the internet. We're now very concerned about how to deal with AI because we simply can't extrapolate all the possible outcomes of the alternative intelligent or artificial intelligent revolution. Look at the mess of geopolitics. We can't wrap our minds around what's going on in the world. There are different versions of truth. And all of these subsystems interact with the climate system and other biophysical subsystems, the ecosphere, which we also don't understand. I explained earlier that we don't even now understand the climate systems. Our models don't replicate it. So we've reached a point where we're changing the nature of the world so rapidly that we've even lost track of some of the things we thought we understood. So in effect, human beings have made themselves cognitively impaired to live in today's world. With our functionally obsolete brains, we are no longer adapted for survival in a megasystem of our own making. So that's a fairly substantial challenge. That's the biology of our problem. And as I said at the outset, there are both biological and cultural factors that have led to this problem. So the cultural factor is also partly a biological factor. And some people are very surprised to see this part of it. But reality is not what you think it is. Human beings construct their lived realities. We tend to make it up as we go along. And what I mean by this is that human groups create very simplified interpretations of reality. We call these political ideologies, religious doctrines, economic paradigms, even our scientific models are made up social constructs. Every culture or tribe generates unique perceptions, which its citizens unconsciously assume to be the one and true reality. And if you look around the world, you can see this at play all the time. Look at the current war in the Middle East, for example, between Islam and Judaism. Two groups that are constantly at war because they have two different made up conceptual versions of what is true in the nature of their religious beliefs. This matters because the culturally constructed frames through which we view reality determine the kind of reality that we perceive. So again, other species take reality as it comes. Human beings filter reality through made-up constructs, ranging from simple myths to very complex scientific models, which may or may not replicate accurately aspects of reality. There's a huge problem here, obviously. People live out of these constructed realities. And again, any tribal myth or political ideology is really a shared delusion. And we live out of our shared delusions as if they were real, as if they were accurate representations of biophysical reality. Sometimes our mythic beliefs are harmless. So if you went back even a few hundred years and said the earth is flat, you wouldn't get an argument. Obviously, the earth is flat. Everybody knows that. Of course, it's completely inaccurate, but it doesn't matter because it was an adequate first approximation. You could live your entire life as if the earth was flat, and it wouldn't make much difference because it was an adequate approximation of the reality as we experience. So it was wrong, but it was adequate. But today's dominant socially constructive narratives are extremely dangerous. So again, I want to make the point that some constructs are harmless. Oops. What have we done here? And others are extremely dangerous. The earth is flat is harmless, but modern techno-industrial culture is living out of a number of very complex, overly simplistic, again, that simplistic thing comes out, nearly universal mythic constructs that spring from belief in human exceptionalism. Remember what I said way back at the beginning. Our culture operates out of a belief that human beings are not really part of nature and not part of are not bound by biophysical laws. And one of the best examples of this is neoliberal economics. This is the form of economics, even now in countries like so-called socialist China or communist China, this is the economics that is running the world. But neoliberal theory and models, including those communist variants, see the economy and the environment as separate systems. The economy, therefore, is virtually untethered from biophysical reality. Economic models contain no useful information about the temporal or spatial dynamics of ecosystems or even the social systems with which the economy interacts in the real world. Many economists assume that exogenous resource or pollution constraints can be overcome by human ingenuity. In fact, it's a common statement that human ingenuity, our capacity for inventiveness, is the greatest resource, because through continuous efficiency gains and technology, such as the so-called green energy transition, we can overcome any barriers to growth. And if you believe that the economy is separate from the environment, that human ingenuity is the major resource, then those two assumptions alone are enough to promote a belief in the construction of a whole culture dedicated to the prospect of unlimited economic growth. And this is the model that shows up in virtually every economics textbook. It's a model of the economy, which operates as a circular flow of exchange value between business and households. Economists see that model and the economy, therefore, is essentially self-generating. You'll notice there's no environment in this model. There's no spatial or social communities. There's no family. There's no personal relationships. This is a social construct. It's a simplification that portrays the economy as disconnected from anything outside of itself. And of course, that's the origin of the quaint concept of externalities. Climate change is an externality because it's not accounted for within the market system replicated by this model. And right now, there's a related material fantasy because the basic model, this one is failing in the sense that we're seeing massive pollution and we're seeing all sorts of ecological problems around the world. Well, we develop another fantasy called dematerialization. We say, based on very faulty, limited, simplistic analyses, that the economy can disconnect or decouple from the environment. So, for example, there is some so-called relative decoupling when the amount of pollution or emissions does not increase quite as rapidly as the quantity of, as the GDP per capita. That's relative decoupling, but it's very limited. So in reality, while there is some relative decoupling, absolute decoupling is almost non-existent, and total decoupling is not even theoretically possible. So again, let me, I suppose, summarize here. We have an economic system that sees itself as separate from nature. There are problems, but those problems can be overcome if we imagine the economy as decoupling from nature and the impacts of growth becoming less and less as the economy gets bigger and bigger. But I'm going to make the case now from cybernetic principles that this is a delusion. The modern techno-industrial society's delusion that the economy is separate from nature violates basic cybernetic maxims. Cybernetics is the science of control dynamics. Stafford Beer, a very famous British cyberneticist, made this very concise statement. We cannot regulate our interaction with any aspect of reality that our models of reality do not include. So remember, our economic models include no important aspect of the environment or even social systems with which the economy interacts. Another way of putting this is called Ashby's law of requisite variety. Ross Ashby argued that if you have a control system, the internal variety, which is the number of possible responses of your control system, must be at least equivalent to the variety or the number of possible configurations of the system being controlled. If you think of an automobile on a highway, if it only had an accelerator and pardon me, brakes, but no steering, it wouldn't last long because it doesn't have the variety to contend with curving roads. So the problem is that when, and this is a quote from Ashby, when the variety or the complexity of the environment exceeds the capacity, the variety or complexity of the regulatory system, the environment will dominate and ultimately destroy that system. So if you're on a curvy road in a car that only has an accelerator and brakes but no steering system, that curvy road, the environment will dominate and destroy your automobile. If you're in an economy that does not take into account the real dynamics of the biophysical environment within which the economy is operating, that environment will destroy your economy. So I'm arguing that our whole techno-industrial society fails the test of Ashby's law. Neoliberal economics, for example, is simplistically reductionist. It lacks the variety needed relative to the environment within which it operates. Its basic models contain no useful information about the structure or functional dynamics of the ecological or social systems with which the economy interacts in the real world. This means that the current economic model we are using to, in effect, regulate global development is utterly incompetent to guide our culture's interactions with biophysical or even social reality. Look at the huge social problems emerging because of the income gap, the maldistribution of wealth, and so on and so forth. So as a globally shared delusional construct, the neoliberal framework, and in fact, the whole techno-industrial framework is potentially catastrophic for solving our true ecological problems. Now, keep in mind, we have one mindset that says the economy and the environment are separate from nature. Humans aren't part of the natural world. And any remaining residual connections can be improved or eliminated through technology gains, efficiency gains. Well, let's look again at a biological interpretation of that same situation. So this is an ecological measure of whether we're decoupling or not. It's based on material flows analysis. And it evolves down to the competitive displacement of non-human species from ecosystems. If we go back just 10,000 years at the beginning of agriculture, wild mammals were 99% of the biomass, the weight, if you like, of mammal species on Earth. Humans were far less than 1%. If we move forward just 10,000 years to the present day, humans are now 32% of the biomass of mammals. Our cattle and other livestock amount to another 60 odd percent. So that together, humans and our domestic livestock, which we use to feed ourselves, have reduced wild mammals to a mere 1.5, perhaps as much as 3 or 4% of the biomass of other species, mammal species on the planet. So the growth of the human enterprise has competitively displaced most other mammal species from their habitats and their food sources. Humans are simply better at exploiting nature than other species, and so the more humans take, the less is available for other species. And it's not just mammals. Wild bird populations are tumbling. Domestic poultry are now 70% of the world's bird biomass. The average populations of thousands of wild vertebrate species, including reptiles, have declined 73% just since 1970. Populations of invertebrates, insects, and so on, are also in free fall. And I've given some statistics here. So the point is that humans are competitively displacing non-human species from both energy flows, their food sources, and their habitat. And this is accelerating other extinctions. So after 2 centuries of spectacular growth, by 2020, the aggregate mass of human-made artifacts, all of the buildings and automobiles and so on, all of this stuff exceeded the weight of living things on the planet. Humans have created an artificial world larger than the living world. Contrary then, and this is the essence of this, to the decoupling fantasy of economists, Homo sapiens is irreversibly an integral, but always potentially malignant or dangerous component of the ecosphere. Human beings have become, directly and indirectly, the greatest and even ever more dominant consumer organism in every single major accessible ecosystem on Earth. Now, you have to understand what's going on here. And that is, again, this complete departure between what we think is going on and the biophysical reality. And there's an even bigger problem. And again, it's a combination of biology and culture that combine to make this a more dangerous situation than we think. There's a wonderful little book in English called Brain and Culture that summarizes the points I'm going to make right now. It's called Brain and Culture by Bruce Wechsler. And what Bruce Wechsler shows is the neuroscientific experiments that illustrate how during individual development, as a young person grows, repeated experiences and cultural norms literally help to shape the brain's synaptic circuits in the cerebellum, or not the cerebellum, in the cerebral hemispheres. It shapes our brain circuitry in patterns that reflect and embed those repeated experiences and thought processes. So repeated thought patterns acquire a physical presence in the brain. So if you think about our belief in continuous economic growth, repeated over and over and over enough, we begin to believe that this is true. And by the way, you can see a world today in which people like Trump and other extreme right-wingers repeat things over and over and over again. They're absolutely wrong, inaccurate, but people hear it often enough and they begin to believe it. So subsequently, once you have a physical representation of reality in the brain, people will tend to seek out compatible data and experiences. And when faced with information that does not agree with these preformed internal structures, I'm quoting Wechsler here, they deny, discredit, reinterpret or forget that information. The world culture, because of its repetitive addiction to technological advances and continuous economic growth, is in denial about not only climate change, but the nature of overshoot. So we are in denial. And it's a problem of humanity that goes back thousands of years. Gustave Le Bon was one of the first psychologists in the 19th century. The masses have never thirsted after truth. They turn aside from evidence that is not to their taste, preferring to deify error. So we always accept our misinterpretations ahead of the truth if we prefer our illusions to the nature of reality. A more modern statement of this kind is by Derek Jensen, an American popular philosopher. For us to maintain our way of living, we must, quote, tell lies to each other and especially to ourselves. The lies are necessary because without them, deplorable acts would become impossibilities. And to make matters worse, we've embedded ourselves now in a new age of unreason, where we're seeing the deliberate social construction of misinformation and false news. So evil forces are taking advantage of these natural human characteristics to construct visions of reality that are totally misinformed and false. And some even argue that we're victims on this level of intentional deceit. Some analysts suggest that the singular focus, even on climate change, has been purposefully engineered to co-opt environmental NGOs. We never hear the environmental movement anymore. It's all about climate change. And it deflates the broader environmental movement by insisting that there are already or ready-made techno solutions. It draws attention away from a fundamental and much deeper cultural malaise, which is addiction to perpetual growth and material accumulation. These are the ultimate causes of overshoot. So again, if we focus only on climate and we make it an economic opportunity to earn profit and so on, then we've managed to not only avoid the real problem of overshoot, but increase the investment in economic activity. And that's what we see happening. Politically acceptable solutions to global heating reflect growth-oriented goals of modern industrialism and neoliberal economics. They include any capital-intensive investment, such as wind and solar power, EVs, non-existent carbon and capture technologies, geoengineering, and so on. All techno fixes that generate profits, create jobs, and otherwise serve the status quo. So I argue that this is simply business as usual by alternative means. Clive Spash has argued that, he's a very prominent political scientist, that disaster policy is designed to serve the capitalist growth-based economy so that the latter becomes perceived as the solution to and not the cause of the problem. This is comparable to changing the coal-fired engines of the Titanic to electrically powered engines and ignoring the fact of climate change, which is, of course, a ridiculous situation, ignoring the icebergs, rather. So there's no point. The Titanic with electric engines would still hit the iceberg. So the quantitative replacement of fossil fuels would merely perpetuate overshoot and the continued degradation of the ecosphere. This is what the last 200 years looked like compared to the previous 200,000. We had 250,000 years of zero growth, almost none whatsoever. And just in the last 200 years, exponential growth from 1 billion people in 1810 to 8.2 billion just 210 years later. So a period of positive and negative feedback imbalance to a period in which we've eliminated the negative feedback, the disease, the food shortages, and so on, which enabled human beings to expand exponentially for the first time in our history in just the last 200 years. And this is the result of fossil fuel use, which has increased by a factor of 1,400 in the past 200 years. The population has gone up 8-fold, gross world product 103-fold, And all of that enormous increase on a planet that did not get any larger. And the real point to make about this is that this period, this 200-year period, which is a tiny, tiny fraction of 1% of human history, is the single most abnormal period in human history. We take it to be normal. This continuous population economic growth we take to be normal is an anomaly. This continuous anomalous fossil fuel burst is the primary determinant of politics and history in our century. It is the source of overshoot. And what goes up will come down. And by the way, none of our efforts on climate change have changed our dependence on fossil fuel. People talk about an energy transition. We're going to transition to solar and wind, but no transition takes place. It's additive. If you look at this graph, it shows the growth of energy use, which corresponds to the growth of the economy and populations, up until just, well, basically right now. I've actually updated this to 2023, so that wind and solar are simply adding to all the other kinds of energy that we've used and amounted to only 3.7% of final energy consumption in 2023. And you notice that the traditional biomass, way down at the bottom, we're actually using more wood and animal dung today than we did 200 years ago. So we did not displace these things with coal, oil, natural gas, and so on. We've simply added to the supply of energy. And of course, that's the intent going forward. This is a universal problem. It's persistent and it springs from our obsolete brains. Not truth, but error has always been the chief factor in the evolution of nations. Barbara Tuchman wrote a book called The March of Folly. Here's a quote from the introductory chapters. Wooden-headedness, stupidity, is the source of self-deception. It plays a remarkably large role in government. It consists of assessing a situation in terms of preconceived fixed notions. That's our social constructs, such as ideology, while ignoring the contrary signs. We're in denial. It is acting according to wish, while not allowing oneself to be deflected by the facts. So the choice before us is simple. Overshoot is a terminal condition. If we remain in overshoot, the human enterprise will be forced to contract. So as an intelligent, rational, self-planning, capable species, we can theoretically choose between continuing business as usual or organizing a well-planned, orderly, and cooperative descent. The problem is we've been socially engineered to ignore reality. This is a wonderful cartoon. People prefer, we are discounters. We want the reassuring lie in preference to the inconvenient truth. But overshoot is real. We have to deal with it. Climate change cannot be solved in isolation from other major symptoms of overshoot. Addressing overshoot directly would both restore a stable climate and resolve all the other overshoot symptoms simultaneously. The problem is that the only solution to overshoot is significantly reduced consumption in smaller human populations. I won't get into that. So if we really want to save ourselves, concerned scientists and citizens must devise and catalyze a personal to civilizational level transformation to a way of being on Earth in which humans can live emotionally satisfying, materially sufficient lives more equitably, more fairly within the biophysical means of nature. That's a huge demand on a species committed to perpetual growth. The question is, can we act accordingly? We are living in a socially constructed paradigmatic trap. We are living not out of reality, but out of socially constructed paradigms, economic beliefs, and social constructs that are antithetical, that are completely against reality. So what is ecologically and socially necessary to reduce overshoot is not politically feasible. But the politically feasible is ecologically and socially ineffective when it's not catastrophic. Thank you very much. I'm about 5 minutes over time, but that's it.